let's focus on Zoom.
Yeah.
Okay, well, welcome. Let's get started. Thank you for joining. Feel free, I'm going to introduce myself in a minute, but just a few logistics. If you have any questions during this session, feel free to type them into the chat box or the Q&A box. And we'd love to know where you're connecting from. So feel free to say hi in the chat and let us know where you're hailing from. That would be great. If you don't know me, my name is Renee Roberts, and I'm a midlife transformation specialist and founder of Nourish to Live RX. So I help you navigate the menopause minefield using my proven blueprint that identifies and resolves the root causes of issues that women face during midlife. And I have a guest speaker with me tonight, Denise Purdy. Denise is a transformational life coach, speaker, and leader of the Modern Matriarch Movement. Her passion is supporting women to achieve new heights in their careers while maintaining love and connection at home, without the overwhelm and burnout commonly associated with ambitious working women. So welcome, Denise. It's great to have you here today. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So, I'm going to pass the mic over to you. So feel free to start, chat away and let's hear. I'm curious to hear what this is all about. It's quite an interesting topic.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So first, I just want to say thank you to all of you that are joining and invite you to engage here with me tonight, because what I have personally discovered is when you show up to something like this, you're here to learn and you're likely here to grow at the same time. And the best way to grow is to engage and to involve yourself in the conversation. And so I'm going to invite you to do that through the chat. So as I share tonight, I'll be asking some questions, I'll be looking for some feedback, and it's a great opportunity for you to solidify and really deepen your own learning based on your sharing and your engagement here. So I'm going to be watching the chat and looking for your comments and for either, questions or just like, oh yeah, that's me. I definitely resonate with that, or I would love to learn how to overcome that, or just engage. That's really what I'm asking for, is engagement, because I know that it will change your experience that you're here to receive. So as Renee mentioned, I'm a life transformation coach, and my passion is really helping women eliminate the burnout in their lives and become the best version of themselves, wholly, authentically, and really live in the powerful being that they are, without fear, without drama, without overwhelm, while maintaining love and connection. What I've personally discovered is every client I've worked with, we just all want to feel more love and connection, especially with our loved ones. But the challenges of life kind of get in the way, seeking more advancement in our career. And then as we build our families and our families grow and the activities expand, we often feel challenged about how do we continue to express love and connection? How do we continue to move into our own desires of advancement and accomplishment while maintaining that, so-called balance. And so it's really a passion for me to support women in that way. And so what I'm here to talk about tonight is something I have called patterns of protection. And this has been my work personally for probably about the last 2 or 3 years, really just looking at what is the cause of some of my own personal experiences and really the limitations of things that I experienced, like why were those present? And as I've dove into this work, I've really discovered that this is present for all of my clients too. And so I want to just start by just sharing, like, what is a pattern of protection? And so first of all, a pattern, if we were to break it down, is a habit, something that we learn, that we start to do based on a set of circumstances in our lives. And so we have patterns that are positive. We have patterns that we would label as negative, and ones that we don't actually desire to continue to repeat. Some of those patterns, right, are like the positive things, like we wake up, we brush our teeth, we style our hair, right? We put on deodorant, so we smell good, we look good, right? All of those things. And so those are patterns that we've established, and really, thank goodness for some of them, right? But then there's other patterns that we develop based on what I would consider negative experiences or exposures to different things in our lives. And that can be something that you experienced in childhood that resulted in a pattern that you have just continued to live out well into your adult life. And that's typically what happens. These patterns can come on the scene at any time, though. It's not just in childhood. Sometimes it is in our adult lives that patterns get adopted. And the reality is they're there for protection. They're there to protect us from being hurt or having the same experience again. And my own journey of this has been that I have protected myself, and more specifically, and this is where I really want you to connect. I'm going to ask you to just check in with yourself. I have more specifically protected my heart from a lot of things. A lot of things. And that protection has actually limited my experience of the things I actually wanted to be experiencing more of. So most of my adult life, I wanted to have deeper, more meaningful friendships. But I also had a very protected heart that I would only let people get so close to me because I had been hurt badly in the past. So I kind of had this like wall. I had this like set of guards in front of that wall that were sort of like watching for any experience that looked remotely like one of those experiences where I was hurt in the past. So they were my protectors. And then if somebody got past that, then I had this brick wall that you had to get past. And not very many people made it past that brick wall. And so that really limited how I experienced relationships in my life, especially as it related to friends. And then in my business and in my career, it's been very much the same. So I would protect myself from having too much success, because what if something, fell apart or broke in that success? So I wouldn't allow myself to experience too much, because then the pain of losing it, let's just say, was too big, right? So I was limiting my risk. I was limiting my exposure. And so we have all kinds of patterns that exist associated with protecting ourselves and especially our hearts from having any kind of pain. And what I want to share with you is, as we look at and as we break down those walls, as we remove the guards, and as we're willing to expose ourselves to some risk, to the potential that there will be some pain, we actually expand our experience for experiencing more of what we want. So more love and connection was what I was looking for. More success. Like I wanted more success, but I was really limiting it because I was protecting myself from it. So it's this like tug of war. And what I've discovered is, as I've continued to eliminate those protectors, those patterns of protection in my life, things have exponentially increased. And it's been the same with my clients. So what I would love to hear is just if you've got any resonance with that. Like, do you identify with yourself protecting your heart? Do you have a pattern that you can see that's present for you? And if so, this is just an opportunity for you to maybe develop some clarity around why that pattern exists. So go ahead and just drop something in the comments and let me know what comes up for you. And while we're looking and kind of waiting there, I want to just give you an opportunity to connect to your heart and just see, like, what's there? Is there even just a little bit of protection that's maybe limiting you from even considering that? Is there a pattern that's present here that maybe is preventing you from even being fully present here in this conversation? Do you have some thoughts about like, oh gosh, well, if I say it in the chat, then I have to admit it and I'm not ready to admit it. So just kind of checking in. Yeah. So being vulnerable is a tough thing. It really, really is. And especially when we're with a group of, maybe so-called strangers, but vulnerability is actually really a superpower, and it opens the door for the connection that we're looking for. So thanks for sharing that, Renee. So when we look at how we're protecting ourselves, there's a really great opportunity to just look at and discover, okay, am I protecting myself here? And what am I protecting myself from? Because again, sometimes our patterns of protection, they're a result of an experience that we had young in our childhood. And it was just something that you developed and you learned in those moments. Let's just say you were 4 or 5 or 6 years old when you didn't have the resources of an adult that you have as an adult. But you've maintained the patterns. They're just ingrained in you. They're a part of how you function and how you operate. And you've never thought twice about them. Maybe you feel like you're a victim to your circumstances. So one other thing to kind of look at is, how do you view your experiences? Whenever you're experiencing something negative, how are you viewing that? Are you viewing that as your responsibility, or are you blaming that on other people? Because that's also a great way to look at and see, where are you in relationship to being connected to your heart, like to the pureness of your heart. So I'd love to just hear, is something coming up that you recognize is a pattern that has existed for a while? And now that we're talking about it, it's kind of exposing itself a little bit. And you don't have to tell me what it is. You can just say, yes, I recognize that, or just drop a little, like you can raise your hand. Because as we connect to these, this is where we have the opportunity to open up and actually allow the walls to be broken down. So connecting to your heart. And this is a practice that I've really come to cherish for myself. And I still find myself sometimes not connected to my heart. But our heart holds all of our desire. It holds all of the visions for what we want in our lives. And if you're not experiencing what you want in your life, it's a great opportunity to come back to this idea of, am I protecting myself from having an experience? And what I want to check in and see is, what if you gave yourself the opportunity to have the experience you want anyway? So maybe you recognize there is a pattern here. Maybe you recognize there's some protection going on, but there's something that you really want to experience. And maybe that is a little bit more love. Maybe that is a little bit more connection. What would happen if you gave yourself that experience? And so just a beautiful opportunity to get curious, because this is where we get to see where what I call the juiciness is. It's where we get to see what's present for us, what is there for us to overcome in order to have more of what we want. And it's not until we really give ourselves the opportunity to look at what's stopping me from having what I want. And most often it is some sort of pattern of protection. So I would love to hear if there are those of you that are willing to share, just if you could identify any kind of pattern of protection that you might notice. I'd love to hear that. And I'm just going to grab a drink here.
I can certainly talk as well. Well, if we get any while people are thinking, but it resonates with me, right? Because I always find that whatever, like, for example, if I don't want to do something, I don't want to go out of my comfort zone, whatever that is, whether it's going out, doing some sort of event or doing something that I just didn't want to do, I find that if I get over that hump and do it, it turns out amazing.
Yeah.
And I don't know what that is. I don't know if that's more protection, but I just know that there's that wall that's there. And as soon as I climb over that wall, break down the wall, whatever it is,
yeah,
it's fine. I get to the other side. I'm like, well, this wasn't so bad at all. And it's like, I feel amazing. Mm-hmm. It's like almost like you get through, there's all these emotions. There's this cycle that you go through, like, oh, do it. Why did I sign up for this? Or why did I do that? Or whatever it was, right? And then you do it and you're like, oh, I'm so glad I did. That's what I find.
Yeah. Yeah. And so there's one of the things that I love to look at in relationship to all of those things is the energetic component. And now I'm not talking the physical energetic component, but all of our thoughts, all of our feelings, all of our emotions have an energetic frequency associated with them. And that's really the work that I look at. So when I'm breaking down the patterns of protection, I'm looking at what's the energy that I'm breaking down or breaking through, right? So whenever you go do the thing that you have felt some kind of fear or resistance to, you're breaking down a negative energy, right? And you're stepping into a more powerful energy. And that's really the work here, right? Is moving that energy around and shifting the energy when you're not in the energy that you want to be in. And a good indicator for that is when we are feeling resistance or when we're feeling off. Like that's kind of how, a lot of people describe it. Like, I don't feel great today, or my energy, I'm off, like I just don't feel good. And so we kind of label it, and it's a beautiful opportunity to look at the energy and the frequency that we're operating from. And it's usually some level of a pattern of protection. Like there's usually something there to protect us. And, if we broke down your example of an experience, we could look at like, well, if there was a protection mechanism in place, what would it be? Because what's the risk, right, that you're facing when you do go out?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
well, yeah. And we could use even an example when I said being vulnerable, because that's something I've never been one of those people that just displays my emotions or wears my emotions on my sleeve, I guess, or my heart on my sleeve. I have not been one of those people. So I think that's a protection as well. So I'm curious though, are there exercises that you do to kind of be able to do that? Like if I wanted to be more vulnerable.
Yeah. Well, it's a practice. That's really the biggest piece. Is it's a practice, and there's a few nuances in here. Sometimes a lot, and it just depends on the individual and what's actually preventing them. So sometimes the nuances are there's a lot of story in there about being vulnerable, and even I would say my experience is that. First of all, there was fear about being vulnerable because you have the fear of what people will think, right? So if I share too much, or if I say the wrong thing, or they disagree, like there's just fear of what people will think, fear of the judgment. Like that's usually hanging out in some context, right? And then there can also be like what I would call conditioning, which is when, let's just say, our parents or society have expectations of us, and our vulnerability expresses something in the direct opposite of that, right? Like what we've quote unquote been taught is acceptable. So sometimes we're bumping up against all of these things at one time. And so the exercise is really learning and kind of getting clear with yourself. What is present here? Like, what is the resistance? Where is this coming from? Is it coming from because I have this, I have this expectation over here from these other people. So I feel like I have to be this version of my, I have to be this person. Or is it that I'm scared, I'm fear, there's fear here about what, am I going to lose all my friends? Right. So, so really, I can't give like one specific process, because it's really the process of breaking down what's causing, right? But I would say it's asking yourself the question. I think if I were to say, it's asking, where is this coming from? Is this from inside me? Is it from outside of me? Because a lot of our influences and the way we function and the patterns that we have that have been created are a result of outside conditioning, right? Outside expectations, outside people telling us, this is how you do it. This is the way it is. This is how we live, right? Like, so.
And it's funny because I think if I look back at certain examples of vulnerability, just either with me or family members as well, I know growing up, my family was never the touchy-feely type. They were never, right? We all loved each other. We all love each other now, but it's like we weren't the big, we just weren't that type of family. And I think my sister has a good example of this. She grew up in that and then got married into a big Italian family, which was very opposite of our small family. And she got over that just through that family, because it's like, well, you have to do what you need to do in that family to survive, right? So you become more it's not vulnerable in that sense. It's just being more close knit, being more open, being more lovey-dovey, I guess, with there's that closeness. So I found that with me as well, whoever I was with, that, I was married and then I'm separated now, but the relationship I'm in now is a lot different than the relationship I had, who I still have a good relationship with my ex, but it was a very different relationship because both of us were more like not as vulnerable, I guess. We were very much the same personality. Whereas now it's like, I get to be vulnerable and it's okay. It's like, I know I won't be judged. And then, I don't know. It's just, it's interesting that I think it's the environment as well, or who you're with or who you're around.
Yeah. And that's actually part of like, one of the things that I would say though, is we believe that it is because we've been taught that our safety comes from outside of us. So like what I'm hearing, and it was my experience too in my own marriage, where I didn't feel safe to actually be in the fullest expression of me, which meant sometimes I was a crazy mess and sometimes I was on top of the world, right? Like I have these like, not bipolarness, but just generally speaking as women, that's actually how we are. We have a wild personality because we have emotions, right? Like that's actually how we operate if we give ourselves permission to, right? But I also think there's as like a societal conditioning that we've gone through as women, as society has expanded to more of us working outside of the home, let's just say, right? We've pursued careers. We've taken on a more masculine role, which has required us to toughen up our hearts, right? It's required us to put walls up and use more of our mind, less of our heart, which causes disconnection. And so part of the work for myself, and even when I do with my clients, is how do we have both? How do we have the success that we want, right? But without the overprotection and the masculizing, whatever that word is, without overdoing the masculine part, and protecting our heart from that perspective. So, so there, again, there's like so many little nuances that kind of come into play, and each person is an individual when it comes to, how you would sort through some of this. But I would say I had similar family experience too. Like my family, I was 19 when I had my oldest daughter, and I just remember I remember having this just the most bizarre experience. Like I wasn't aware that my family didn't really say I love you until I had her. And like, that's all I wanted to say. And I was like, wow, this is weird. Like, why didn't I didn't have the wisdom and the knowledge and the training and all the skills that I have now. So I didn't quite grasp it then. I was so confused. Like, why didn't my parents say this more? Like cause it just wants to come out of me. Like, I don't understand, and now I see it. I realize that my family has their own patterns of protection, right? Which I also learned. Right. And so like, there's so many places that it's like, wow, we learn these patterns without even knowing we're learning them. So sometimes we get put into situations where more vulnerability is required. And, it sounds like that's kind of what happened to your sister. It kind of happened to me a little bit. It's a funny story. But the short of it is I was in direct sales for a little bit, and the company I was in was like all hugs and like, it's this whole, and I was like, what is happening here? Like I have a bubble and I expect you to stay outside of it. And so that's really when it started breaking down for me. But it wasn't until more recent years that I really learned the value of vulnerability. But first with myself. And I want to go back to that. Like, this is really about knowing that I don't actually need other people for me to be safe with myself, right? So there's a little bit of a process here of flipping from an outward, right? Looking outward for feedback, looking outward for safety, to looking within for safety and finding and cultivating more of that. And as you do that, vulnerability then becomes a no big deal because you're not concerned about what people are thinking, right? Or fearful because you've got your own back.
I wonder if some of that comes with age as well. Like I've noticed that these people that I know, more women than men, because I think men just, they are very different, right? I think men just, I could be wrong, but the majority, right, of men that I met. But with women, I think you get to a certain point where you're like, yeah, I don't even care anymore. I am what I am, and you don't like it. Too bad. This is who I am now. But I think it takes a while to get there for a lot of us. Like, at
Yeah.
least it did for me. Where I was so worried about what other people thought. Now I'm like, no, this is who I am.
Yeah, I think that there's a piece of that because like and again, and this will come back to like conditioning and these patterns a little bit, because when you just think about the cycle of life and how society has conditions, right? And society has standards. And if you think about it, so many of us have been trying to meet those standards, right? Like when you think about to me, there are 1,000,001 or more, really more ways to define success. But if you asked people what they're trying to attain, it's society's view of success, not their own, right? And so like, we also have that with other things, right? Like what makes me a good mom? What makes me a good wife? There are societal views that dictate that, where right. And the reality is like, as we continue to try to like meet those standards and we're just like continually feel defeated. Yes. Over time, we're just like, that's not working for me anymore.
Exactly.
So, and it's just about how do we get to that realization, so what I would say to those of you listening is it doesn't have to, if you're not there yet, where you are at that point where you're like, I don't care about other people, you don't have to get to the stage where you're like writing everybody off because you're just so irritated and burnt out and right, bitterness and resentment. Cause that's also what comes into play sometimes is, right, I'm going to do me, but I'm super bitter about all the people that don't like it. Right. So it comes back to that energy. Like we can do the same things, but what's the energy? What's the frequency we're operating from? Is it truly out of self-love for myself? Like I can tell you now today, this version of me is doing me out of self-love for me. Like I'm working on myself. I'm becoming my best self for me. But some people are doing it despite other people, right? And that there's a negative energy that's kind of fueling that.
I get it.
And that can cause more burnout. It can cause more resentment and bitterness because it's not an internal drive. And that's never very, right? It's just a short-term motivator usually.
Got it.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So patterns come into all of these things, right? All of these behaviors. And then we have that energetic association that you get to look at and just discover like, okay, what's the motivation for this? Is it because I'm trying to prove somebody wrong or right? So that's a little bit different conversation, but there's still patterns that come into that.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. Awesome. Anything else that comes up for you around that?
Not really. One thing, well, I guess, it's interesting that you said that because I think when people are motivated, do things for themselves, I think sometimes I've talked to other people and I've heard other stories where people have started off on a direction saying, I want to do this because, I'll just throw out an example, somebody gets divorced, whatever, and has to start over. And they're like, I'm going to make this work. I'm going to show my ex that I can do this. I can live on my own. So I think it starts off that way, but I think deep down, it's also for themselves as well, because they ended up being successful. They're like, I was able to do that. I was able to surpass. Was it a spur from that event?
Yeah.
Probably. But I think deep down, you're right. I think that's when you really can become successful at it, is when you are doing it for yourself.
Yeah.
And, whether you know it or not.
Yeah. Well, and there's typically a time in there that people, so, cause certainly we can use a negative, let's just say, I don't actually like to label things as good or bad or positive or negative, but for all like keeping things in terminology that people would understand, we can certainly use a so-called negative experience to create a positive. It's really just how long do we let that be the actual fuel for it, right? And so if you never convert it from let me prove it to you to I'm doing this for me, you might find yourself in overwhelm and burnout because you're constantly churning away at trying to prove more and more and more, right? So,
Yeah.
but when you're doing it for yourself, there's actually zero to prove, right? So the energy isn't like, oh, I have to do more, I have to accomplish more. It's really like, oh, do I want to accomplish more? Do I want to go to that next level? Yeah. Okay, then I'm going to do it, as opposed to, let me show you, right? So again, those are like, when we look at an energetic scale, those are two different energies. And so, and my belief is just that when we do it for ourselves, it's just a positive, more lighter, just better overall experience of whatever it is we're looking to, experience, versus down here, you're just like constantly going, and there's usually never a break
Yeah.
or, right, a feeling of satisfaction because it's to prove something.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, one of the, let me just check in here. I just want to kind of just check in and see, like, is there anything that hasn't been covered that I feel like that would be beneficial for everyone listening? Yeah, I want to share. I didn't talk about this a whole lot, but I do believe that this can impact our parenting. So for anyone that's here and listening, I know that there are some that are probably empty nesters, right? So you might have grandchildren in the picture. Your kids could be out of the house. You could be mixed. Like, I have one that's often married already, and I have a couple still at home. So I know that the gamut can be wide here. But in terms of patterns of protection, and especially patterns, like, one of the things I'm really passionate about, and you mentioned in my bio, and in my introduction, I'm the leader of the Modern Matriarch community. And one of the things that I'm really passionate about with patterns is just, what patterns are we passing on to the next generation? And so that's why when we look at our own patterns of protection, and like we've discussed, right, those get passed down because they're just modeled. So we just learn it. We're a sponge. And so I would love to just encourage those of you that are listening to just consider that for yourself. Are the ways that you're behaving day in and day out, are they a demonstration of the patterns that you want your own children or grandchildren to demonstrate? And that's been a big deal to me. So as I mentioned, I was 19 when I had my oldest daughter, and there's something wrong with being 19, but it's hard, right? Like, it's just hard to be a young parent. And I realized at that point that I was in the family pattern. So my mom was 17 when she had my brother. My grandma was 18 when she had my mom. There was just this history of, like, okay, either in high school or just out of high school, having a kid, not married. And I had decided then, okay, I looked at what was next in their relationships and in their lives. And I was like, okay, hold on a second. Neither one of them had happy marriages. So I'm not signing up for that. Like, I'm not going to do the next thing, which was to get married. And I really just committed then to creating my own life and creating and living in such a way that my daughters or my children could model, if they wanted to, how I lived in my life. And that does come back to, like, this whole internal self-reflection of, what are the patterns that I'm modeling for them? Right. And it's not like all of that faded away at one time. So I think what I would like to just share is, this isn't just like you just make a decision one day, I'm no longer going to have any of these patterns, right? It's like, over time, different patterns have been exposed that I've been like, oh yeah, that's another one that I don't want to continue passing on. So one of those, I used to yell a lot. That was just like my knee-jerk reaction, because that's what I grew up in, was you get angry, you yell, or something happens, you yell. And so, that's been a pattern. So it's really just an opportunity to look at, and you can see this in other places too, because how you do one thing is how you do everything. So you might not yell at the office, but you might have that same internal boiling, right?
Yes.
And then you might have a control pattern that's also associated with that. So we talk about patterns of protection, but we also have control patterns where we want to control and manipulate situations. either so we don't have this internal boiling, or so we can deflect it, or something, right? So there's all kinds of patterns that come into play. And so just, from my heart, I just am sharing that your family life, especially your relationship with your children, is a great opportunity to look at and look within and ask yourself about your own patterns and what you're demonstrating. Because research says, and this is what gets my heart, so I'll feel a little bit of emotion around it, is that we have the ability to impact the next 7 generations. And I just feel like that is so big, right? Like, whew, that can be heavy on your heart if you gave into too much thinking about it, right? But that is my motivation for why I do what I do, because I think, man, I'm not going to be alive in 7 generations. It'd be great, right? But I'm not going to be. But I'd like to live this life knowing that I'm impacting the next generation in such a way that 7 generations from now, the world looks completely different than it does right now. And that's my hope. That's my, so I think I would, that's my like biggest message in terms of looking at your patterns of protection.
Yeah. Wow. I didn't realize 7 generations. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's crazy.
The history is fascinating, and I won't go into too much of it, but I've really been looking at, just really recently, I dove into this a little bit more, looking at, the last, I don't know, probably 5 or 6 generations, and how whatever, so like if the current generation that's coming up, right, the event that's going to impact them is COVID, right? That's going to inform a lot of what comes out of them as a generation, right? And every generation has that. Every generation has some major experience that shapes them. But what I also know is we have so much information at our fingertips now that 5 generations, 6 generations ago didn't have, right?
Yeah.
Because they didn't have what we have. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have all of those things. And so with that information, we have the opportunity to choose consciously how we want to impact the next generation, right? We don't have to wait for a catastrophe. We don't have to wait for something to inform that. I mean, there are things that are still going to happen, but we can work with them, right? So what I mean by that is I have lots of open conversations with my kids around decisions that they have the opportunity to make as a result of what they're experiencing, as opposed to just being stuck in the experience, right? And reacting to it. They get to respond instead, and we get to do that too. And so it's just a really beautiful, I think, opportunity to shape the world and what it's going to look like in 7 generations.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting too that, it's very different. Technology is a blessing and it's a curse. Absolutely. Because when I was young, I don't know how old you are, but when I was young, we didn't have all this technology. So things happened at school. Whatever happened at school, whether it was good or bad, it stayed at school.
Right.
It was not, people didn't have their phones. They weren't taping. I'll show them. They weren't recording. They weren't doing lives,
Right.
Right. But nowadays, geez, I was having this conversation just as, a couple of weeks ago about this, that, if people slip up or they do something, geez, it can be recorded forever. Because it gets on the internet, it's forever.
Yeah,
right?
like your face could be on the front page news at any moment,
Exactly. And that is something that I can't comprehend, because when I was a child, it didn't happen, right? Yeah. It's weird. It's bizarre. It's, it's something that I can't relate to because I didn't have to go through it. Now we can go through it now, but that's different. We're, we're older, we know better. But when you're young, you do stupid things, or you don't think when you do things because you're still developing, your brain's still developing. And anyway, I just thought that was fascinating. And so it's interesting to see 7 generations from now. What the heck? What the heck are they going to have that we don't even know about now?
I think about that a lot too. So because if you if you really looked back, and most of us don't have the family alive still to ask the questions, right? But if we were to like look at what each generation over just the last, 3, 4, 5, 6 generations, what they experienced and what came out of that, what habits, what behaviors came out of that, you could probably look at your own life and see like, oh, that's totally still present in my life. Like that's still here. And one of the stories I learned a long time ago that's really a representative of this is, let's just say it's probably someone, either my generation or maybe my daughter's generation, is learning the Thanksgiving feast, right? They're learning how to prepare the turkey, and they're going through the whole motion of it. And as they're preparing, mom, so like, let's just say me, right? Let's just say my daughter, she's 24. She's learning to do this whole process. So I'm teaching her, and I tell her, well, you have to cut this much of the turkey off. We cut it off. And then she asks why. And I'm like, I don't know. That's just how I was taught. And then we're like, let's ask grandma. So we asked grandma. She's like, I don't know. That's how I was taught. And then we go back far enough. And then it's like, oh, well, we used to cut it off because the pans weren't big enough back then. Right. But now we have pans that are big enough. We don't even need to do it, but we're still doing it because no one thought to ask the question. Right.
That's funny. Yes. That is
so
true.
Everything else is like that. Right. So if we just got curious, like, why do we do the things that we do? It's usually in some sort of pattern. Is it a pattern of protection? Maybe, maybe not. But it's still a pattern, right? So it's still an opportunity to look at, like, is this still relevant? Do I want to keep doing this? Does this fit into what I want for myself? Right. So
exactly. That is so funny.
Yeah. So yeah, and if we don't teach, and this is just, a little sidebar, but I'm just really passionate about teaching our kids how to think for themselves, because there's so much room for that now, right? And I want them to have the ability to think for themselves, so that even though I'm modeling things for them, they get to make a different decision, right? They get to make a different choice about what they want for their own life, because it's not my life, it's theirs. So yeah. So fun. Well, I have enjoyed this conversation. I appreciate you engaging back and forth. And I feel like there's probably a lot there that others will resonate with. And I'm happy to answer any other questions, or answer questions in email if that's where they feel most safe, I guess, to to connect with.
I'm going to put stuff in the chat just so people can go and find out who you are. I've put your website, and although the website didn't come up, I forgot to put the HTTPS.
Okay. Yeah. And that's okay. You could email me to Denise at Denise Purdy.
Well, I'm just going to type it again. There we go. You guys are all going to get the replay anyway. I'll send out an email. They'll have all your information as well. So if you have questions, definitely please reach out to Denise. And it's been what a fascinating conversation. I was very excited because it's different. It's different than what, I've been doing this series for, I guess, 2 years now, maybe more. I can't remember how long I've been doing it, but it's nice and refreshing to have something completely different come up as a topic. So this was very interesting. So I don't know if anybody has any questions, but feel free to type them in the chat. If not, feel free to reach out to Denise directly and ask away. So thank you so much, Denise. Thank you for everyone who has joined. And if you're watching the replay, thank you for watching. And feel free to reach out and let us know what you think.
Yeah, awesome. Sounds great. Thanks, Renee. I appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.